If you could just imagine for a moment yourself as a young child, 10, 11, maybe 12 years old, and you're out with your family one day taking a walk, and suddenly you're accosted by this group of men who forcibly abduct you, kill your parents, and ship you off to another continent to work as a slave. Could you imagine the trauma, the terror, the fear that would be going through your mind? Well, today we're going to be talking about that kind of story with the Book of Negroes by Lawrence Hill. Stay tuned, that's coming up here on Drew's Book Reviews. Well, good day and welcome to another episode of Drew's Book Review. So as mentioned in the intro, we're going to be talking about the Book of Negroes. This is going to be a bit of a combo review between the book and the miniseries, which is available to view on CBC Gem here in Canada. I don't know where you might be able to access it elsewhere, but I did find it on CBC Gem in Canada, the miniseries based off of this book. So the Book of Negroes, as mentioned in the introduction, is a story about a young child, Aminata Diallo. She is an 11-year-old African girl who is forcibly kidnapped from her home in Africa and marched across the continent and shipped off to America to become a slave in the Carolinas of America. This is a story, historical fiction, something I don't normally read. I typically do not read historical fiction. I'm mostly a sci-fi fantasy guy, but when I saw this book, I thought, wow, that sounds like it might be an interesting read, and I'd really enjoy reading it. This is a story about heartbreak. It's about defeat. It's about perseverance and survival against all odds. This story follows our main character, Aminata, through decades of her life. From the moment she's taken in Africa to she finally finds herself free again and helping to build a brand new community with a group of over 1,000 other former slaves. So this really is a fantastic story. It's heart-wrenching, it's graphic, it is triggering. That's important to know. This story is triggering because it deals with a lot of content, sensitive content really, between slavery and just the incredible abuses inflicted upon Aminata and her fellow slaves through their ordeal and having to become the slave to terrible people. And those who feel that they can justify what they have done as something good and righteous and liberating for the people of Africa. It really is sad to see how it was justified. And while this is historical fiction, as I understand, the Book of Negroes is taken from the diaries and manuscripts of those who survived the slave trade, and their stories and things that happened to them have been incorporated to create this fictional narrative based on the reality of what was going on in the slave trade. And it really is a difficult, heart-wrenching story, and definitely dark story for a variety of reasons. And honestly, it's one that I enjoy. I love those stories that really kind of hit you hard and think, wow, this is crazy, this is serious stuff. Stuff that gets you to think, stuff that kind of makes you wonder, it's like, how did they manage to justify things that way? The stories that really get you to think are things that I really enjoy, and that's what I really enjoyed about this. So when I do read historical fiction, I often find that I'm pretty selective on the ones that I'm going to pick up. And this one, I'm glad that I picked up. I don't even know how long this copy of the Book of Negroes has been sitting on my shelf. It's just been there a long time. Our story, of course, as mentioned, starts in Africa. She's eventually sold to a slave owner in Carolina. She suffers loss to so many. She loses her husband. She loses her children. But she is a self-taught woman, which is pretty powerful in and of itself, especially for someone in her circumstances. She learned to read. She learned to understand the language of her captors while doing everything she could to make sure that her captors never learned her language, so that she could understand them, learn from them, take those learnings and use them to her advantage. It was through her self-education that she managed to rise above her station, essentially, and becomes someone who's in a position of influence and power to help her fellow brothers and sisters in the slave trade. Eventually, she finds herself in New York, where she encounters free Negroes, free former slaves who have gotten out of slavery, or maybe those who were never in slavery to begin with. But she becomes friends with the community that is developing in New York. And eventually they find their way to Nova Scotia. Now, and from Nova Scotia, they eventually get back to Africa. So it's really a generational story taking place over several decades. One thing I absolutely love about this story is I love books like this, historical fiction, where I find that I'm not only captivated by the story and what's being told and the writing style, which Lawrence Hill does so well in this, to really connect with the character and care for them, but also being able to learn some about that history. As an example, that I never knew about the race riots in Nova Scotia in the 1700s. I had no idea that that was part of what most people would consider Canadian history. Although Canada wasn't a country at that time, it is historically part of what has become to know as part of Canada, Nova Scotia. And there were race riots there due to the black population, the Negroes as they're called in this book, being able to, willing to work for less. And tensions were building up between different groups of people because of that, especially with the struggle to farm and grow crops and have land enough for people. And tensions came to a halt, and then we had the race riots. This is something I didn't know about. I went and Googled this because I didn't know about that. I didn't know that Freetown, Sierra Leone, for example, was actually settled by former slaves, over 1,000 former slaves who sailed from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone to start a new colony and called it Freetown. This is something I didn't know. I Googled that, I looked that up, I learned a little bit about Freetown, Sierra Leone. So much of the events portrayed in this book are taken from actual historical events. So after reading this book, I had to pick up and go watch the miniseries because I thought, wow, this is so interesting. And I thought I'd heard about a miniseries called The Book of Negroes before. And so I checked it out. You could watch it on CBC Gem in Canada. I don't know where else you could view it, but I went and watched it on CBC Gem in Canada. So really the only reason I signed up for CBC Gem is so I could watch The Book of Negroes, the adaptation, because it was really the only place where I could find it. The adaptation itself, of course, did make several changes versus what we see in the book. Changes were how some characters die, for example, are brought about within the miniseries that we don't see in the book. So there's definitely some changes there. Aminata's husband, for example, some changes to his character arc were made about, when he comes into the picture, when he doesn't, because it was a huge battle. They only saw each other, it seems like, once every couple of years because they're constantly being separated by their slave masters and kept apart. And it was a challenge for them just to see each other, which was heartbreaking in and of itself. And definitely the faith that Aminata had and that Chikura had as they struggled for survival, and they would stop at nothing to see each other over and over and over again whenever possible, was just incredible part of the storyline. Which is weird. I think that I love that part so much because I'm not one for the romancy thing, but I just felt it was done well within this book. And the miniseries, I think, did a decent job capturing it. Now, for the miniseries as a whole, it was an okay miniseries, to be completely honest. I didn't think they did an absolutely horrendous job adapting the material. I think they stuck to the spirit of the material quite well. Despite some of the changes that were made, I don't think those changes in and of themselves were actually bad. I think they still worked well in an effort to tell the story as a whole. One thing I will say about the miniseries compared to the book is that the miniseries absolutely toned it down a lot of the context within the books themselves. But this was an understandable change and a vitally important change, I think, as well. Because when Aminata is taken from her home at the age of 11, some of the way in which they were treated, I don't think it would have been a good idea, really, to showcase a child of that age being treated in the way that she was being treated. I don't think that would have been good to do that. They had to make some changes to tone it down, considering the context, the age of the character, and that you have a young child who's maybe only 11, 12, or 13 years old portraying this young Aminata on screen. You can't have had those type of events, that type of treatment, having a child of that age act that out. And I can appreciate why such a change was made for that, because these are important things that need to be discussed. They need to be respected in any form of adaptation. So I completely understand those changes, and I think those were good choices in terms of adapting that to the screen. But definitely even later in life when Aminata is an adult and some of the things that have happened to her, they even kept that actually toned down quite a bit as well. I think of a network like HBO had adapted it, we would have seen much more graphic, detailed portrayal of these events. So those are just kind of my thoughts on the book, a little bit of my thoughts on the adaptation as well. Overall, I would say this, if you like historical fiction that deals with serious issues of our history, then absolutely the Book of Negroes I think is good. If you like those kind of dark tales where, some might call it grimdark. I know grimdark typically is applied to fantasy books more often than not, but definitely I would say this has a grimdark feel in many ways. But I'm an amateur to grimdark. I don't read a lot of grimdark. So, you tell me, have you read it? Would you agree with my assessment of that? Anyway, those are just some of my thoughts there, and I do want to thank you very much for watching. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to join the Discord. That will be linked below. And as always, until next time, keep on reading. Bye!